welcome everyone to this online program of the American Writers Museum. We're pleased you're all able to be here with us tonight. My name's Allison Sansoni and I'm the program director at the museum. We've got a few short housekeeping things to go over while everyone is still making their way inside. As you're watching this conversation, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box in the middle of the bottom of your screen. We're going to monitor that for questions, and at the end, we may read yours out. We apologize in advance if we don't have time to get to everyone's questions. We'll try to ask as many as we can. If you like this program and the kinds of online programs you've been seeing from us in the past year, you can become a member and get special advance notice of programs and offers, including private tours of the museum virtually and in person when we open again on May 14th. And you can preview our upcoming exhibit on Ray Bradbury, Inextinguishable. Our YouTube channel has videos posted of programs from the past 3 years. You can check that as well for news and updates. Our book selling partner when we're open and here online is Seminary Co-op Bookstore, and you can order tonight's book online from them from a link that we'll post in the chat once we begin. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Museum of Broadcast Communications, which can be found online at museum.tv. Their upcoming events include a Women in Radio panel you won't want to miss, so be sure to check their website for details. We're grateful to all of you for being here and for valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. Honoring America's writing, especially the writing of our past, requires us to let go of the stories we think we know and discover the ones that we were never told. Tonight's guest author, Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, went looking for the story of television's beginnings and found that the people who created it in its present form were 4 women: Erna Phillips, Gertrude Berg, Hazel Scott, and Betty White. Through their stories of overcoming gender, racial, and religious prejudices to create, write, and perform the types of shows we still watch today, Jennifer's book, When Women Invented Television, casts the form in an entirely new light and gives us all a greater understanding of where TV came from. Jennifer's work in writing about popular culture includes books about the Mickey Mouse Club and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, as well as the New York Times bestseller Seinfeldia and the recent Sex and the City and Us. She also co-hosts the American Writers Museum podcast Dead Writer Drama with Zakiya Harris. She's interviewed tonight by author and scholar Susan Douglas, who is on the advisory board of the Museum of Broadcast Communications, and the Catherine Neefe Kellogg Professor and Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of Communication and Media at the University of Michigan. We're very glad that they're able to be here tonight, and we're going to have them join us here.
Hi there.
Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer. And I just wanted to say how very much I enjoyed this book. It is lively. It uncovers unknown history. And, and there are many parts of it where it's kind of a page turner. You want to find out what happened next to these women. So I've got a ton of questions for you. So let me start. So, you've written several books about television and especially women in television. But what led you to write this one? And how did you choose these 4 women? And what was that process like?
Yeah, I love this question because it really is. There is a real origin story here. It actually goes back to the book that I wrote that came out in 2013 about the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. And while I was researching that, you have to think about, okay, this show took place in the 70s. And I was, it almost always takes you back a good 20 years or so when you're doing the research for a book. What influenced this show? What led up to it? And 2 big things happened. One was that I was asking the creators, James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, about any of the influences on the character of Rhoda, who's Mary's best friend on the show and is, openly Jewish. And this was a big deal at that time. We actually hadn't seen an openly Jewish character on television since the time that we go back to here, the late 40s and early 50s. And that character, and they mentioned her to me, was Molly Goldberg, played by Gertrude Berg and created by Gertrude Berg. And I just thought, I don't know who that is. And I went to Google her and found out she had been such a huge star and just a powerhouse, right? She created, wrote, started, and produced her family sitcom, The Goldbergs. And, you know, she was voted America's most trusted woman after Eleanor Roosevelt. That's how popular she was when she was on radio first. She had a line of house dresses. She had a cookbook. It just to give you a sense of like the bigness of her celebrity. Everybody knew who she was. And I just thought, this is crazy that I don't know who this woman is. And she predates I Love Lucy. You know, I thought Lucy was this one woman who did so much, which she is. She's incredible. But I had no idea that there was this powerhouse woman who kind of came before her in the sitcom genre. And the other thing that happened with the Mary Tyler Moore Show was that Betty White was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and she played a character named Sue Ann Nivens, who was the happy homemaker. She had a show on the channel where Mary's character worked, on the station where Mary's character worked. And the character was kind of like, you know, she had this perfect persona in front of the camera. She wore frilly dresses and she would bake something on, you know, TV and the camera would shut off. And then she'd just become like a stone cold bitch instantly. And that was sort of the joke of the character, right? And the way that they described in the script before they cast Betty, the way they described this character's persona on the screen was a Betty White type. And I thought, I don't know what that means, because my first experience with Betty was, I mean, actually, I think really my first experience was Golden Girls. And then I went back, loved the Mary Tyler Moore Show, loved her on it. And then I was like, I didn't know she was around before that. So I went back and looked, and it, of course, you know, they were not wrong. She really had this persona from the early 50s when she was on Los Angeles television. And she had one of the first daytime talk shows. They really didn't know what to do with daytime hours at that time on television. You have to realize they made television and they were like, we don't know what to do with this. So one of the answers turned out to be, for this Los Angeles station anyway, Betty White. They put her on 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, being incredibly perky and sweet. And that is where that persona came from. And so this was another signal to me, like, oh, there were these women doing all of this stuff. She also ended up, because she became so famous from that, she ended up spinning off a sitcom based on a character she created kind of in the talk show world. She was doing sketches and she created this character of a married woman, and she ends up creating, producing, and starring in this one of the first sitcoms, Life with Elizabeth. So I had no idea all of this went on. And the more I looked, I realized there were a bunch of women doing stuff all over the place in television, even before Lucy and concurrent with Lucy, that we didn't know about. And the real reason turns out to be that, you know, radio was still where all the money was. And so television was this wide open space where no one quite knew what to do. And so I think women kind of instinctively saw that they had an opportunity to rush in there before everybody else got there and kind of stake a claim and do their thing. And that is kind of the genesis of this whole thing.
So, you know, I wrote a book about radio along with 15 years ago, whatever. And what I was interested in is getting past the hardware invention that men made. And that's what you've done in this book. You're interested in what I would call the software invention, right? The forms of television, especially when it was this wide open terrain. And you have these women inventing shows and genres. So talk more about that. And especially, you know, Erna Phillips, who was such a pioneer in inventing one of the absolute classic, if we would want to say, software forms of television.
Yeah, and Erna Phillips is a Chicago girl, so we have to highlight that when we're with the American Writers Museum in Chicago. Erna Phillips created the daytime soap opera, and what happened was she started in radio, and her boss in radio said, "We need something to that women will like, so that we can sell them things." so that we can run ads, right? Of course. And she came up with what we would now recognize as the daytime soap opera. She focused on domestic dramas. And in fact, her earliest creations, she had all female characters. She would voice some of them, and she'd have like one other woman doing some of the voices. And that was it, just these little tiny dramas. Often she was very interested in setting things in boarding houses, which kind of makes sense. You can imagine that way you don't all have to be related. You can have people who are not related but living together having these little domestic dramas. And so she also is responsible for some key elements of the form. And one of them, they're all pretty funny to some extent, but also very influential in some cases. One is the organ cues. If you've ever seen, probably mostly now you would have seen this in a sketch about, making fun of soap operas. I think about something like the Californians on Saturday Night Live. They do some of this stuff where they're still using these forms to make fun of it. So the organ cues to tell you, something really dramatic just happened. And then the dramatic pause when they all, after someone says something shocking, when they all look at each other. She loved those a lot. I did a lot of archival research, and in her papers, when she would write notes to junior writers on her shows, she'd say, make better use of dramatic pauses. And another thing that she really pushed forward was the cliffhanger. And so I think that in particular, while of course, we knew she didn't invent suspense, but that really key everyday use of the cliffhanger to keep her listeners and then viewers coming back, watching the story day after day, wanting to know what's going to happen next. I mean, this is so key in what we watch now on something like Netflix, right? I mean, this is how we end up binge watching on Netflix. So she really had these incredible instincts in terms of putting these elements together. And she brought that from radio to television. She had the first ever daytime soap opera called These Are My Children that was produced in Chicago, but broadcast nationally. And that was a flop. But eventually she brought over The Guiding Light, which she had started on radio, and she brought it very successfully to television. They actually kept it going. They just kept the same story going, simulcast it on television and on radio. And this was a huge hit. So if you think about that show, I mean, that ended not that long ago. It was going forever and ever and ever, and it started on radio. So it's something like the longest running broadcast show ever, because it actually even predates television. So she obviously had enormous success eventually bringing these to television, and had kind of an empire for the 50s and 60s and beyond.
So one of the things I found really fun and interesting about the book is the challenges of doing live television. And, some of these women, Phillips and Berg had been on radio, and all of a sudden here's live television with a camera. Can you describe some of these challenges? Because I think people would love to hear about what these challenges were, and especially for women who are coming from radio to then, where there were cameras.
Yeah, I mean, these are all the things you have to think about that are almost hard for us to comprehend now, because TV is so endemic in our lives. But once again, they just, TV is just happening. And yeah, they're coming from radio where, you can be in front of a microphone. That's why Erna could do 3 voices on her own show. She did not go in front of the camera once she was on camera with her shows. So, Betty, for instance, is on the air 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, improvising with no script. And it's live. And they're, they also had to deliver commercial spots. All of these women did. And she, that too got really funny at times, because she was very into memorizing the script for her commercial spots, but would forget sometimes, and be like, so you do this with the doohickey and the, so that is incredible. There's also this really amazing anecdote about Buster Keaton, the genius physical comedian, was on her show once as a guest, and she had to do commercial spots, and he wandered in and started like interacting with her and doing bits while she was trying to tell you like about this toothbrush that you could buy at the local drugstore. Gosh, I wish that were on film that we could still see, but it is not. But yeah, I mean, even Erna's soap operas, they had to memorize their lines, which was something they weren't used to from the radio. And so some of the early reviews said things like, said the actors looked like they were scanning the horizon for threats, but what they were doing was reading their lines off of a chalkboard off screen. So that was really challenging. Gertrude is live with her sitcom that's scripted. And so that's an incredible feat in itself. And they had to do crazy things like she would just wear 3 dresses. And so if there was a scene change where it was supposed to be the next day or something, she'd go off stage, take off one dress, the next one's on underneath, run back out, look, it's the next day, like that kind of thing. And even Hazel Scott, which we haven't gotten to yet, but she had a musical variety program. That's a good example of why we had a lot of variety programs at the time, because it's a little simpler than memorizing lines and all that. But even Hazel Scott was live and sweating underneath they had really hot lights then, and just had to kind of like power through that and she was this very elegant jazz musician playing music for you, and just had to like, stay with it and be on top of it and go with whatever happened.
So yeah, I wanted to get to Hazel Scott actually next, because the kind of common wisdom until your book was that the first show that was a variety show or not a sitcom was hosted by Nat King Cole, and she had a pioneering role here. So can you talk about that, and also talk about why her pioneering role, but really all of them, have been either underappreciated or forgotten?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons for that. And Hazel is such an incredible example of this, because she just was so famous at the time. It's just another one of those where you're Googling it and going like, have I found an alternate dimension? Why don't I know about this woman, And the way I always describe her is that she was kind of the Beyonce of her day. Beautiful woman who was a jazz musician. Her 2 big things that made her famous as a jazz musician was that she could play 2 pianos at once, and not easy to do. If you've ever played an instrument, not easy to do. And she also was famous for swinging the classics. So what she would do is start out, playing Bach, a traditional Bach song, and then kind of as it goes, she'd make it jazzier and jazzier, and people loved it. And I don't blame them. I can see how this was a huge hit. And she, traveled all over the country, toured a lot, sold out places, and was married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a congressman from Harlem. And he was a preacher, incredibly charismatic himself, really handsome. So they were this power couple. They would be on the cover of Ebony magazine all the time. People wanted to know everything about their lives together. And they also were not just a famous power couple, but a political power couple. They really they worked together, kind of used their platforms to advance their ideas about civil rights. And so a great example of this is that she would not play segregated venues. If she walked in and saw it was segregated, she'd walk right back out. We have to remember this is still the Jim Crow South. Right. And then she'd give interviews to all the newspapers about it and kind of draw attention to this. And she would often say, I don't understand why someone would come to see someone who looks like me, pay to see someone who looks like me, and not want to sit next to somebody who looks like me. And so she was just this unbelievable sort of powerhouse personality, and the Dumont Network, which was the 4th network at the time with ABC, CBS, and NBC, offered her the chance to have her own variety show, which at the time could be, it wasn't that variety-ish all the time. Sometimes, especially musicians would really mostly do their own thing. They'd play their music banter a little bit, that kind of thing. And she was perfect for this. I mean, you can't see recordings of the actual show, which we can talk about in a minute, but you can see recordings of her performing on YouTube. And if you see that, you will see that the camera loves her. Like, all she has to do is say, hello, my name is Hazel Scott. And you're like, I'm in, I'm with you, I'm staying here. And people loved it. It did really well. It got great reviews. It went from a local show in New York City or New York area on Friday nights to several nights a week to national. And that is when, you know, that made her the first Black person to have a national primetime show. Before Nat King Cole was, I mean, his was big because that's when everybody was watching TV and people really know about it. But she really had the first, and was really, like I said, had great momentum going in 1950 when this was happening. And all of the reviews I read were saying, like, please give her more to do, give her more time. We love her. And unfortunately, she ran into the blacklist, the Hollywood blacklist. There was a big sort of round of communist scare in 1950 when this publication called Red Channels put out this list of people they just decided might be communists. This is how it worked. And then they kind of just sat back and waited and let, you know, advertisers and networks and things kind of like freak out about it and fire people at will if they wanted to, if this freaked them out enough. And she was in the book. And at first it was fine. Months went by when everything was okay. But things really took a turn when there was a woman named Jean Muir who actually got fired from a different show for being on the list. And this really opened the floodgates. And a lot of people after that were in danger of losing their shows. And she turned out to be one of them. And they do it in this really nefarious way. They just say, like, oops, we can't find an advertiser anymore. And this really happened after she decided to speak up for herself. She decided she was going to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Willingly, she volunteered and actually begged for a spot. They didn't want to let her, and she really wanted it and kind of made a stink about it because she was a congressman's wife. And they let her come before them, and she gave an incredible speech, really fiery speech, kind of just explaining to them all the ways they were doing everything wrong and why they were wrong about it and how everyone should rise up against this. And instead, she ended up losing her show. Which is a real tragedy because I have this kind of fantasy of an alternate timeline where her show gets to keep going, you know, until the time of Nat King Cole's show. And great, he gets one too. But, you know, I think she could have been a real, like, actual TV star that we remember for that if she had been allowed to keep going. But that's exactly the kind of thing that the blacklist intended to do, is to get rid of more progressive voices and that sort of thing and kind of just bring in the white men instead. So she was really fed up and eventually, not that long afterwards, moved to Paris for a few years. So I think that kind of sidelining, very deliberate sidelining, and then her kind of moving away for a while, and also a big factor in us not knowing who she is that, especially in the TV world, is that recordings of that show are lost.
Right.
So if we can't see it, if we can't stream it now, we don't believe it happened, right? So this is true of several of the women to some extent because of what we were talking about. This was the era of live television. And so they really didn't think at that time that we would ever want to watch something again after it aired. And so, you know, I mean, I keep imagining them, you know, how you would have old VCR tapes and you just tape over something. I'm imagining them just being like, I don't know, sure, put that on. We don't need that. And anyway, a lot of these recordings are either very bad. The early Goldberg's recordings are not good quality. And in the case of Hazel, her recordings are gone entirely. And that's a real shame.
Yeah, I mean, the technological lapses contributed, as you point out in your book, enormously to some of this material being forgotten. Because if you had old kinescopes, even if you didn't have those, then you had nothing. But if you had old kinescopes, you described, you know, some records just being dumped right?
Yeah.
Dump, you know,
Yeah,
this,
there's a story. I don't know if it's true, but there's a great story that I love that's very indicative of this, even if it's not technically true, that when Dumont was bought out by another network, that the other network was just like, we don't need this, and that they dumped all of the archives in the East River.
yeah. I've heard similar stories about early CBS records being plowed under on some, farmland on Long Island, and you don't know if they're apocryphal or not. But yeah, without that kind of record, you can't see this stuff. I mean, I remember Gertrude Berg from her SOS commercials. I mean, right? Her,
Right.
um,
Yeah, she did. She kind of revisited her character and did her catchphrase, which was "Yoo-hoo, is anybody?" She would call
Mrs. Bloom.
"Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Bloom." She would call out her window on the show to her neighbors because they were in a tenement building, and this was her big signature move: is that she'd call out and then they'd answer and they'd gossip in the air shaft between their windows. And yeah, her grandchildren, who I talked to for the book, told me that that was how they knew she was famous, is that, because she was just grandma to them, but they were like, oh no, we knew her, and our friends knew her as the lady from the SOS commercials in the 60s.
So I want to come back very much to red channels in a minute, because McCarthyism and racism and anti-Semitism plays such a central role in your story. But I also wanted you to talk a little bit about, because you do this in the book, how hard these women worked. I mean, how many hours? Can you talk a bit more about that? I mean, they worked so hard. So can you give us a flavor of that?
For sure. I mean, these women were so ambitious, and I don't know if the men were working this hard. They may have been, but my God, it just really, these women were incredible. So, I mean, we talked about Betty a little bit, but keep in mind not only that time on the air, but eventually she keeps doing the talk show that I talked about, that 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. For a while, she's doing that and a sitcom at the same time. So she would go like directly on a Friday, she would go directly from that job, the daytime job, to across town to do her sitcom live, and then go home, and then still have to get up on Saturday morning, to go do another 5.5 hours. And so she's doing crazy stuff like that. She also had to do rehearsals at some point for Life with Elizabeth. She would often workshop scripts with her script writer. They would drive home together after the taping or not taping, but live broadcast on Friday night. And they would talk about script, and then he'd write it over the next few days, and then they'd start all over again. Hazel was often touring in addition to doing the show, though she did really love this. When she was really in the thick of the show, she loved it because she felt like she could mostly stay near home and do the show. Erna Phillips often had multiple shows on at once and wrote an insane amount. Her output was just incredible, and she was always coming up with new ideas too. Several of my women actually end up in the hospital, right, pretty much due to, it's clear that these were stress-related incidents for them. Erna ends up in the hospital with heart problems for a while. Gertrude has a really scary hospital stay where she had to get blood infusions and stuff. Gertrude was an incredible worker. Her relatives said she really didn't like to not be working. She liked to be working and surrounded by people. And so even when she was on hiatus from the show, she would have another project. She would be developing something for radio, or out promoting her line of house dresses. She would go on these tours to department stores. So she loved it because she could talk to her fans and ask them about their lives and have this interaction. So she was always going. She was always doing something. She didn't really like to sit still. And this is, obviously it's a product of them being women who want to make it in this world and need to prove themselves more than a man would have to, because they can never let up. That's the feeling I get from just reading about them, is that they could never let up. And Betty talks a lot about, she loved to work. She loved it. And she would always be like, it doesn't bother me. I don't mind. I love it. But when you look at her schedule, it really was something.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a bigger question, but that gets at really one of the main themes of your book, which is what did in not just these women, but what did in the kind of, vibrancy and vitality of early television. And that's McCarthyism and the rise of red channels. And so, when I think about early television, and certainly what you have written about this you talk about it as kind of the frontier, the Wild West, when these women are part of inventing all of this. And you also think, there were working class shows, immigrant shows. I remember Mama, even the Honeymooners, which was, one set thing pretty much, with working class families. And then by the late 50s, we've got Father Knows Best. And you have an arc in your book about how and why that happened, both via sponsors and via the government. So it's kind of a big sweeping question, but can you talk a bit about that arc from this early Frisian, experimentation, and then Leave It to Beaver?
Yeah, exactly. And that was as we were talking about earlier, like that was my question going in, is just like, clearly something happened. And the part where I start to know about it is I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best. That's what's on my radar as somebody just consuming old television, right? So I pinned it to about 1955 is when the sea change is like real, but it's coming as early as 50, right? Because that's when the red channels list comes out. And it's kind of like complete by about 1955. So another thing that we haven't totally talked about yet. So Gertrude also has, tangles with the blacklist in an indirect sort of way. Her TV husband, Philip Loeb, was on that list with Hazel Scott. And he was a big labor activist in show business. And so that's why they came after him, also Jewish. And I also even have theories about maybe they would have liked to come after her, but they couldn't quite get it. They couldn't quite come up with how to do it. So they went after him. And anyway, she at first tries to, she says she's not going to fire him. Her sponsor, General Foods, demands that she fire him after they were successful getting this other woman, Jean Muir, fired. And she says no at first, and then kind of starts negotiations behind the scenes with them to try to figure out if we can get the show back on the air. And it's not going well. And summer comes, the end of their season comes, and they're off the air for a couple months. Okay, fine. She's still negotiating behind the scenes. She is not successful. And by the next fall, CBS just mysteriously decides they're not going to have the Goldbergs on anymore. They say it's for budgetary reasons, but if you look at the budgets, they're no different from other shows that are even less successful than the Goldbergs. So that makes no sense. And in fact, Lucille Ball comes in and goes on, I Love Lucy premieres on the night that it was supposed to be with the Goldbergs. It premieres alone, becomes a phenomenon. The rest is history. While the Goldbergs is stuck off the air without their television father. She's trying to figure out how to make this work. And it's off for long enough. She eventually gets it onto NBC, but is not able to get Philip Loeb back on the show. And so ends up having to make a choice between never having the show on television again or firing him. And she ends up firing him with, letting him go and continuing to pay him as long as the show is on. And replaces him. She actually replaced him twice. First one didn't take. And it's never quite the same, especially at that time. I think at a time when you really had to, appointment television was the way it worked, being off the air, and then they were screwed around they move them around the schedule all the time. It just never had the momentum again. And I also really feel like I love the early episodes with Philip Loeb. She and Philip Loeb had something really special. And it's not the same when you just bring in another guy. and the show is never the same. And I think this is another reason why we don't know this woman, is that she just lost momentum at the absolute key moment. I mean, I didn't mention this, but at the time that the show went off the air, it was the first show to be made, TV show to be so successful, it was made into a movie, and so successful that it went back to radio after having come from radio. They put it back on. Mm-hmm. So it was big, and they just yanked it off the air, and it was never the same. So that is a huge reason why her legacy is so muddled, and therefore not something like Lucille Ball's. And in addition to that, yes, I think that the McCarthyism, of course, was a piece of a broader kind of movement. Men were moving into the industry because it was becoming profitable. At the beginning of our story, TV sets are so expensive that, very few, it's like less than a quarter of Americans have them. It's something like $10,000 in, current money terms. It's a lot. So not everybody has it. Whereas by the mid 50s, it's starting to saturate. Mm-hmm. Movies are freaking out. The movie industry is freaking out by then. There was a pop song called TV is the Thing this year. So this was when it becomes big business, and the men all move in from radio and kind of take over. And so even Erna and Betty had absolutely lesser struggles. They, didn't have something like the blacklist, which I think we can guess why, Hazel Scott and Gertrude Berg, a Black woman and a Jewish woman, ended up in that situation. And these two white women who also were working in daytime and also were working outside of New York, which I think helps even more, dealt with more traditional sexism. Erna was constantly second guessed. She had to finance her own pilots multiple times to prove this woman had been incredibly successful, and she's still, every time she pitched a new idea, they wouldn't finance her pilot, and she would pay for it herself, prove that it's a good idea, and then everyone would want it and everyone would want to do what she was doing. But because soap operas were extremely denigrated. All of the reviews were incredibly dismissive because they were written by men who were in the position to write reviews. Who wants to hear these sobby women's stories, blah, blah, blah. But she really knew how to serve her audience, and she was constantly fighting to do that. I had a fascinating time reading some memos about Betty White's show. She eventually got a national talk show in 1954 called The Betty White Show on NBC, and was going great at first, but they just kind of second guessed it to death. There were all these memos among men at NBC that I read. I mean, literally saying things like, well, dames really, they called them dames. Dames really like emotional content, and so we should give them more emotional stuff because that's what the dames like. It was that kind of thing. And by the end of the year, she had gone from kind of all these stories saying she's the next big thing, and she was eventually. So it turns out okay. But she kind of went from, the next big thing to, by the end of the year, they had second guessed her show to death and moved it all around the schedule, and ended up firing her and replacing her with Tennessee Ernie Ford, who was a male pop singer at the time.
One of the things I found really interesting and moving in your accounts of these women was how racism and anti-racism affected their careers and their choices. Can you talk a little bit about that? I also found it interesting that you cited an article from Ebony in 1950 that was hopeful about representation of African Americans on television. The magazine said there was many as 10 all Black shows of various genres on TV. That's a forgotten history. But I think that's related to how some of the women you talk about dealt with racism, but also put their foot down about anti-racism as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was fascinating to me too. And I think, by the way, just for context, because it's so shocking to hear that statistic, I felt that way too at first. And I realized they're talking about local shows too. So that's all around the country. But still, like there was, like you said, there was this long article that was like talking to all these actors saying, we feel really good about this. We think it's going to be better than radio has been for us. We think that they have these, you know, at the time, TV still felt really progressive and open, and were, you know, they felt like they were getting these roles that were not necessarily super stereotypical. And it's one more way, like once the white men moved in the mid 50s, it's like everybody's kind of like back to the old ways of radio, in the worst possible way. But yeah, some of, you know, the obvious one, you know, Hazel obviously dealt with this a lot and was so outspoken, and was never going to not be outspoken. I think that, you know, it was her quote downfall in television that she spoke out, but I just can't imagine her doing anything else. And I think it's so heroic what she did. I hate that the story end. You want the story to end a different way. You want the music to swell and everyone to be like, no, we have to keep this wonderful woman on television and we need people to speak out. But that's not how it was. And, you know, even like Betty White had a regular on her show named Arthur Duncan, who was an amazing, beautiful dancer. And she really loved him and had met him like on the LA circuit and brought him on her national show. And I think it was, I don't know this, but you know, the change from being an LA show to a national show is pretty big. Now she's in the South too, and got lots of letters about him, and was not going to take him off her show just because she got lots of angry letters about it, and really, really loved him and kept him on. And it really was a big break for him as well, because he actually went on to be really regular on the Lawrence Welk show, which was a big deal,
right?
You know, and even, you know, Gertrude was similar. She had Black characters on her show. She wrote, even back in her radio days, she wrote for Eartha. She wrote a character for Eartha Kitt, which I love. You know, she had there were a lot of progressive ideas out in the ether in the earlier days of television, and like you said, the Ebony article is the perfect kind of example of that. Is like there was this real sense of hopefulness, and it's no surprise that, you know, that the McCarthyites come in and be like, nope, that's not what we're doing here, and that is how things change.
You know, I loved that theme in your book where you talk about these early progressive instincts in television that all four of these women embodied in different ways. And there were others with them that were trying to bring, you know, just surprise and diversity and difference into TV, and how that ran against a counterforce of, you know, white patriarchal political conservatism. And they were two very interesting cultural forces that collided. And as you point out, you know, we know who won.
Yeah, father, he knew best.
Yeah. So let me ask you one last question, because I know we're going to turn it over to Q&A in a minute. So who did these women pave the way for?
I mean, you know, I think it's so important for us to know that they were there, because they did, in some sense. First of all, they just invented these forms we still use, and you can see that all over the place. But we're only just now getting back to sort of parity with the amount of women that were working in front of and behind the camera then, which is crazy. But, you know, I think that they had this to some extent. And what's really exciting about now with streaming is that it's very important to have not just like one or two women's shows, so that those shows have to represent all women, which they never do. I wrote a book about Sex and the City, and I feel like that show really had this kind of problem where like it's supposed to be the women's show, but it's about 4 rich white women in New York City, you know, and that's supposed to be for all women. Whereas now we have such a diversity of voices, and so many more women like making the content that they then star in. So it's, you know, there was the 2000s kind of movement that was hopeful and great with like Tina Fey and Mindy Kaling and Shonda Rhimes, who are still all doing stuff. And even more exciting now, you've got like Issa Rae with Insecure, and you've got Michaela Cole with I May Destroy You. Like, I was watching I May Destroy You this summer while writing this book, and I just kept thinking, like, what would these women think if they could see a show like that? Like,
Right.
it would be I mean, there's so much that would be mind blowing. They would, like, just streaming itself, but the fact that there could be this kind of show made by a Black woman about, her own perspective and experience is just, I think they'd love it. I really do. I think they'd be really excited to see that.
I bet they would, and at least Betty White lived long enough to see enormous changes in the industry and to keep acting and, being badass in Cleveland.
Right. When you think about what that woman has seen, like, think about the trajectory of television that woman has seen in her lifetime, that she can stream, she can see I May Destroy You. It's just incredible.
Well, thank you to both of you for that fantastic conversation. We have a few audience questions. I just want to remind folks that if they do have a question, they should type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'll read out a few of these before we have to end tonight. Our first question is from Jeanette. Jennifer, what was the most exciting or unexpected thing that you uncovered during your research?
Oh my God, there were so many times, and it drove me crazy because, like, the whole point of the book is to tell everyone about these women, so no one knew them yet. So it was like, my partner Jesse is like the only one. I'd constantly come home and just be like, you're not going to believe this. There was so much. It's like every time I think of something, I'm like, I fell in love with all of them at different times. But it was so much fun to be in Gertrude and Erna's archives. This is the first time I did super extensive archival research. So I was reading all of their letters from that time, and people would type long letters to each other and super confessional, even Erna with her advertising executive contact at Procter and Gamble. They had like this incredible friendship. He was a man. I don't believe anything was going on. Like, it was just, he was married. She'd send him flowers for his anniversary. She was godmother to his children. He was godfather to her children. They'd write these letters back and forth between Ohio and Chicago with this incredible detail about their personal lives. And like, here's how the kids are growing, the kids acting up, here's what's going on with it. Like, it was just fascinating. And sometimes I could see cigarette burns on the pages from her, and that just like did something to me, because it was just such a reminder that she was this real person, and that I got to tell her story, and I wanted to do it right. So it was constantly fascinating to kind of delve into this very personal level of information.
And thank goodness that those letters survived, that you could do that.
At least we have that, right? Like, I mean, if we don't have all these recordings and things, and I mean, Hazel Scott's son too, Hazel Scott's son, Adam Clayton Powell III, is really wonderful. And I interviewed him for it. He had visited his mother on set and could remember it. It's one of the, besides, all I had was these variety clips describing the show and him saying, I went to the set and here's what it was like, because he was like 4 or 5 years old. And he also was generous enough to sort of let me rifle through her things. Essentially, I went to his house, and he had stuff it actually ended up going to the Library of Congress shortly after he was organizing stuff to be her archive. So I got a sneak peek at the archive before it was archived.
That's amazing. We have a question here from Julie. Were any of the women you studied possibly queer or have any interest in telling queer stories?
I don't think so. Not that I know of. Not really. They were actually very, I kind of chose them for their variety of experiences in personal relationships, but I did not find any queer women. Hazel was married with 1 child. Gertrude was married with 2 children. Erna had adopted 2 children as a single woman. Betty was very proudly and happily single, but did not find any evidence of that. And I would be fascinated to know if anyone had ever tried to tell a queer story at that time on television.
Yeah. I have a question here from Jeff. There were a number of women producers in the early days of TV on children's shows like Olga Druce, Judith Waller, Beulah Zachary. How important were they in the scheme of things, particularly since so many producers of the late 1960s and 70s grew up watching these shows as children?
Yeah, I would think that they are really important. And, I think all of that kind of like emanates outward. I just don't see how it can't, because it shows at least some people in the industry that women can do these jobs. It sounds stupid to say that out loud, but that's just the way they thought. It puts them in positions with men who kind of go like, well, this one's okay, So I think of even something like later, my book about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. One of the things I was fascinated by was the fact that they employed so many female writers. Not just that, but the way that it then kind of like emanated outward from that they went on to be executives and to create their own shows and do that sort of thing. So anytime you can have women in those positions, I mean, I imagine that it was easier in the sense that men may have let them do that because it was a children's show, because it was daytime. Like I said, I think Erna and Betty being in daytime really shielded them from some of the difficulty of the rest of the industry, of women in the rest of the industry, because men didn't want who cares about that women's stuff in the daytime or the kids stuff in the daytime. But still, I think anytime you've got women doing, jobs, and like you said, especially doing that for, that those little boys who watched that grew up to make television in the 60s and 70s.
And that leads us to a question from Margaret. These women seem to have paved the way for Lucille Ball. Did she recognize that and pay that forward?
I don't know if she recognized that. I certainly think it's the case to some extent. She does hit right in the middle of my timeline here. So, so some women had come before her. And then, well, all these women did come before her, but then she she's on the air concurrent with them for a number of years. So they would have been like colleagues, essentially. What I do know is that she and Betty White became really good friends later. And I love I love thinking about that. And really kind of gave each other advice. I think that Lucy was giving Betty advice more because it was like Betty was going into having her own sitcom after Lucy had already done it, whereas Betty had been on the talk show before. But I love it. And they stayed friends until Lucy died. They stayed friends their whole life. So I love the idea of these legends. They would send each other flowers. They got together sometimes. They gave each other advice. And really, I mean, I think we're definitely equals as their careers progressed.
That's incredible. That would be an incredible coffee table to be at, wouldn't it?
Oh my God. I can't even imagine. So funny, so brilliant.
I have a question here from Paul. Was there any favorite interview or anecdote that didn't make the final edition?
I'm not sure if there's one that I can think of off the top of my head that didn't make it, but I can talk about interviews a little bit. Gertrude's grandchildren were really fun to talk to. And there's something, I don't know, it's very interesting to talk to grandchildren because they're a little bit removed. It's different from the children. And they had some great stories. There's one that's in the book, but I will just tell you as a teaser that this is what pops into my mind. And this is why I love interviews, is because you can't get this anywhere else. He told a story about how he went to, I believe it was Schraft's, this restaurant on the Upper East Side in New York City with his grandmother, Gertrude. And this is when I asked, did you know she was famous? And I think he would have been, I'm guessing this right now, maybe 5 to 7 years old at this point. And he said, he told the story better than I will now, but he said, they went in and this was her regular spot. So she went, and she was always dressed beautifully. So they went in and sat down, table was clear, the way was cleared for them. She sits down and they just come in right away and bring her a soft boiled egg, like ninjas. And because they know this is what she loves. He's like, I think this is disgusting, but she loved a soft boiled egg. And it comes in a little cup, it's very dainty, but also ostentatious. And She cracks it open and says, "This egg is cold." And they swarm back in, take it away, and then bring a new egg. And it was fine. But he said that's when he understood that she was someone.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'm going to end on an audience, on a question from your podcast co-host, Zakiya Dalila Harris, who wants
cross promotion.
exactly, who wants to know if you could go back in time and attend a live taping of any of the shows you researched for this book, which one would you choose and why?
Oh, that's so hard. That's so hard. But I'm going to just say the answer that came to my head first, which is probably the Goldbergs.
Right.
I'm tempted, like, it's like Betty White would be cool, but then also, oh my God, Hazel would be playing two pianos. And she's a legend. But I just feel like the Goldbergs had so much going. It was pretty early. I'd love to go to like a 1949 Goldbergs, really early. Those were my favorite episodes too, to just watch plot-wise, because they kind of weren't as sitcom-y yet. Like they have the stuff there, but it's like they're not as predictable. They don't know what a sitcom trope is yet. And so I would go back to one of those. There's one where Gertrude thinks that her husband is cheating on her with his very hip new secretary, and it's really delightful. And I think I'd want to go back and see that. But it's live. It's a live sitcom, and she's like got 3 dresses on and, you know, running around. I think there's something fascinating about this, very DIY. I think there's a lot of parallels even to now, and especially in the last year, I've been thinking about people being on Zoom and we've seen big stars basically produce themselves from home. And I think of that a lot when I think about some of the stuff that these women did. I mean, Betty too, right? She's just out there like, I don't know, here's this character. Do you want to see me do that? I don't know. Let's try this. So Betty would do like her own hair and makeup and her co-host hair and makeup. Like this was all very, very DIY. And I really respect that. And I would love to see that from start to finish live would be incredible.
Well, thank you both so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Jennifer and Susan. The book is When Women Invented Television, and I'm going to put the link in the chat for everyone one more time tonight. There you go. So check that to order from our bookseller partner. I want to thank the Museum of Broadcast Communication for their co-sponsorship of the event. And Jennifer, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. And we'll leave the window open for just a little bit longer so that everyone can copy that book link out of the chat. But we hope you join us again for a program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan.